Hi, Misha here, and this is one I thought would be kind of fun and interesting, and one we can kind of complete now that the final member has been released. Today, let's talk about the Sukhoi family of fighters derived from the original SU-27, which was originally built as a heavy, long-range fighter-interceptor in the Soviet Union, but it really did not come around and come into full service until right at the end of the USSR, and therefore was quite preeminent in the 90s and 2000s in the modern Russian Federation, the Air Force, now today the Russian Air and Space Force, the VKS. It's also seen use, even some still today, in the Russian Navy with the Naval Aviation, the Air Arm. And this is really the modern Russian fighter. We think of MiGs when in Russia, and there are some MiG-29s and MiG-31s and MiG-35s around. But it's the Sukhois that really take the cake. It's what we've seen used in places like Georgia, Chechnya, Syria, and yes, of course, Ukraine. And the reason I can now finally do this video is the final model I needed was released. The SU-30. These are all 1/72 scale die-cast, manufactured by Hobbymaster. So they're all in scale with each other, all with the same feature set. And I try to pick ones that are all kind of modern takes. For example, this is an SU-27SM or SM3. Their current update of the original. This is the SU-30SM. They also use a slightly modernized version known as the SM2 today. Here we have the Navy's SU-33. This is the carrier-based version. A little old now, but it's been updated. Then we move into the fighter bomber version, the SU-34, and I pick the updated one that has the missiles on the wing tips versus strictly air-to-surface. And then finally, what is essentially Russia's preeminent frontline fighter today, the SU-35S. Yes, I know the SU-57 Felon gets a lot of attention. The truth is, even in 2022, at least as of right now, there's only like 4 of those in service. So, not exactly a overwhelming fleet. So, we'll have a general comparison and just talk about these families a little bit together today. Why not? Before we get going, like I said, these are all Hobbymaster models. Therefore, they have the same features. They're mostly die-cast metal. In fact, their Sukhois are quite impressive for how metal and large they are. And they come with a stand with the metal stem. If you don't want to use the stand, they do have landing gear you can plug in. They have opening canopies with removable pilot figures. And they come with ordnance that you can install or not. And some Hobbymasters will have moving or interchangeable parts. For example, on these, the air brake can be deployed up or down. And on the later SU-35s, they come with thrust vectoring nozzles for the engines, so you can angle them or keep them straight, whatever you'd like to do. Very nice models. Other companies make Sukhois, for example, Air Force One, but I would say the Hobbymasters are a little better. They have concealed screw heads and just a little better quality. But it's up to you. Differences. There's pros and cons to everything. But I'm really happy now that they finally wrapped up the entire lineup. Not going to be talking about the SU-24 and SU-25 because they're not part of this design lineage, as is that SU-57 the Felon. I wanted to just focus on those that are directly derived from the SU-27. And so, why don't we start with it? The Sukhoi SU-27, and like I said, this is an updated SU-27SM. It's a relatively recent model I picked up a year or so ago, and these are still very much in service in the VKS today. They're showing about 229 in inventory, of course, give or take, and so that's the largest single number of any of these on the table today. They're also used by the Russian Aviation wing of the Navy, the Naval Arm, as kind of shore patrol fighters. And this did start off. It started off flying in the late 70s and first went into limited service in 1985-86. And it really didn't start to appear in large numbers until 1990. This was designed to be the large, long-range, high-performance, maneuverable counterpart. The MiG-29 was the short-range, kind of point-interceptor fighter, kind of analogous to maybe an F-16. This was designed to go up against the F-15, the F-14, and other fourth-generation planes. And for its day and time, it was pretty impressive, especially out of the Soviet Union. It was fly-by-wire. It used some of their advanced missiles like the R-27, and eventually the R-73 would be a common one, so medium and short range. It had a very good range of about 3 to 3,500 kilometers, just kind of depending on the load, and that's without external tanks. These didn't carry those. They've got a lot of internal stowage for that. They've got a lot of capacity. It carries one 30mm cannon with 150 shells, and it has 10 hard points, 4 under the fuselage, and 3 under each wing. Well, you know what I mean, like 2 and 1 on the tip. And the typical payload could be up to 6 medium-range air-to-air missiles and 4 short-range air-to-air missiles. Because in the beginning, this was designed to defend against bombers like the B-1B, and also escort Russian bombers like the Tupolev. So that was the original role. It was an air superiority. It was a fighter. It was an interceptor, and that's kind of where it was at. Size-wise, performance-wise, it's going to set the trend for most of them we're going to talk about in this video. It's about 72 feet long with a wingspan of just over 48 feet. Maximum speed at altitude is over Mach 2.3, and towards sea level that dips down to just over Mach 1.1. So it's still supersonic at sea level, though just barely. Max altitude is 62,000 feet, again kind of given its role. Crew of 1. And yeah. These were produced in the 90s, although of course budget things would intervene. It wouldn't be until 2002 that Sukhoi would work on kind of a midlife interim solution that would be shown off the next year, and then in 2004 the Russian military would get interested and order these, with the first couple of dozen being built in 2006, known as the SU-27SM. And then another 24 would be built in around 2008, 2009, and they started to replace, and they would upgrade some older machines. They would do a lot of things like just refurbishing airframes. Some would get upgraded engines, but the main thing, they would give them air-to-ground capability, turning this into a multi-role fighter. To do this, it received a new radar, longer range, ground targeting ability. It also had a new glass cockpit, new heads-up display, new multicolor displays. They would use this stinger in the back, which in the very beginning was just there for balance. Later, they would install chaff and flare dispensers back here. They would also install defensive radar back there in later versions, so on and so forth. These would carry updated R-77 missiles, newer air-to-air, as well as the KH-29, KH-31, other air-to-surface missiles. They would also carry laser-guided, the KA-B bombs, KA-B 500, 1500, so on and so forth. And at this point, they can carry just shy of 10,000 pounds payload, still on 10 hard points for the SU-27SM. In 2011, we would get the SU-27SM-3. A dozen would be delivered to the VKS, as it is known today, and these actually would be from a canceled Chinese contract. They were very similar, but they had further avionics updates, further modernizations to let them be compatible with newer weapons. By this point, we're getting sat-nav, even some GPS operations with them. The main thing with the SM-3, they have a reinforced airframe and 2 additional hardpoints under the wings. Like I said, this one's still an SM because it has the 10, but the SM-3 would get a extra hardpoint under each wing to further kind of let it carry more stuff. These are still being used as multi-role, not true ground attack on the forefront. They're still patrol fighters, but you know, they're shifting into that more and more. And the first military combat deployment would be a squadron sent to Syria in 2015 of the new SM-3. And by today, the SM-3 is kind of the standard. Most of the aircraft in the Russian service would either be SM or SM-3 variants. Most of the original SU-27Ps and S's are either retired or upgraded. And these have seen continuous use in Syria and, yes, in Ukraine. Typically, they will have an air-to-air payload so they can escort friendly aircraft, but they often carry 2 to 4 air-to-surface munitions, including on this model here, so they can help have strike missions. So kind of analogous to the F-15 Strike Eagle, amongst others. That's just kind of how modernity goes. So officially these are still in production, but it is a dated design. Mostly what Sukhoi is doing is just updating existing airframes and refurbishing them. But this only started the family. We're going to skip around a bit, next moving to maybe the oldest version really in service today, the SU-33. By the way, the original SU-27 was known as the Flanker-A, with later versions, pretty much all the full production versions, known as the Flanker-B. The NATO reporting name for the SU-33 is the Flanker-D. This is a navalized version designed for the Admiral Kuznetsov class carriers. They have kind of the ski jump, kind of the British style. And it's actually one of the largest carrier aircraft in the world too. And it was designed to be a carrier-based fighter, but really from the beginning it was designed to have some air-to-surface capability, although initially it was unguided, so rockets, iron bombs, the like. Work on this dates back really to the late 70s, early 80s, when it was known as the SU-27K, and the earliest prototypes flew just a couple of years after the SU-27 went into service. They delivered the first batch of around 6 or 7 to the Navy in 1990-1991, and they would begin carrier trials and all that. And these would continue even though the Soviet Union would fall through 1994. And towards the end of 1995, the first 13 of these were on Admiral Kuznetsov for a cruise. And this cruise would last until 1996. At this time, the SU-27K is still not officially adopted. In fact, its official service would not come until August of 1998. And Sukhoi would rename this kind of for marketing purposes because they were trying to sell these to places like China. They were not successful, but they were trying to market it, so they named it the SU-33 to give it that new generation feel. The Russian Navy initially ordered 72 because it planned to produce 3 carriers. In the end, the other 2 carriers were scrapped, and therefore the Russian Navy only ended up obtaining 26. So that's about it. Plus production stuff, Sukhoi only made about 3 dozen of these total, including all prototypes, variants, and all that. So it was mostly not successful, but it still serves on Kuznetsov today. And it is very, very similar to the SU-27 we looked at. In fact, it's also 72 feet long by 48 feet. It does have a larger wing, and it does have canards in the front for landing and taking off on carriers. Also, for carrier use, the wings can fold, as can the stabilizers fold down for storage. That's pretty neat. And she does have more carrying capability, up to 14,000 pounds. Of course, fully loaded, you're not going to get very far because this is a carrier. In theory, it has a range of 3,000 kilometers, but in reality, again, if you fully fuel it and load it up and all that stuff, it's hard to get off the deck of a carrier. Of course, they could operate these from shore as well. It does still have the 30mm cannon with 150 rounds. Maximum speed's about the same, about 2.2 Mach at altitude, reducing down to just over Mach 1 at sea level. Maximum altitude itself is quite a bit lower, just based on the mission profile, about 56,000 feet. So that's alright for what it is. Still a single seater. It does have a reinforced frame, especially to land on carriers. It also has a double wheel landing gear in the front, again for carrier operations. It has a tail hook, you know the deal. It's carrierized. So these were in frontline service, although they did not see combat as the 21st century rolled on. In fact, they planned to replace these with the MiG-29K, but in reality, they ended up deciding to just refurbish 20 of them around 2014, 2015, and use them until they were kind of done. And this refurbishment included installing an upgraded engine, at least on some. Also, new radar warning systems, and updated avionics to work with newer air-to-surface munitions, giving it some limited guidance capability. For example, they could use the KH-31, KH-41, KH-25 anti-shipping and anti-radiation missiles and what have you. And they typically just carried the R-73 and R-27 short and medium range, and they often would carry rocket pods and iron bombs, usually about 500 pounds. So they would receive a bit of a midlife upgrade. And they would actually see combat for the first time towards the end of 2016 when the SU-33s on the Admiral Kuznetsov were launched and sent against terrorist targets in Syria, well, terrorist in Russian terms, and they would drop bombs on them, various installations and camps. And they would continue to see use throughout, but production is long over, and the upgrade, the midlife update, was not enough to get it a new name like SU-33SM. It's just kind of, they only have one carrier. They really don't want to invest a whole lot of time and money when the planes are there. They know their shortcomings. They know what works on them. I think they're just kind of waiting to see what kind of happens next. One thing I should point out, the original SU-27 did not have the capability to refuel in the refuel in the air. The SU-33, though, does have aerial refueling, which absolutely makes a lot of sense. So you can launch it, get it in the air, and then refuel it so it can actually get where it needs to go, kind of helping with that range and endurance. And it did pioneer some things for the design, but this was really Sukhoi's last gasp effort at making a carrier fighter. They really have not looked back at it since the SU-33. And it's just it's a neat little footnote, but not exactly influential for the next generations. And with that, let us move on. Now we come to the newest model on the block from Hobbymaster, the SU-30SM, the Flanker-C. Interesting plane that almost didn't exist in a way. It does date back to the 1980s, and what was known at the time as the PVO, it was the Air Defense Forces, essentially to defend the skies of the Soviet Union. They needed a new interceptor, interdictor aircraft. They had the SU-27P, but they needed something with better endurance, better range. Also, they could maybe operate as an aerial command post if the worst happened. To kind of fill this need, Sukhoi looked at the SU-27UB, the two-seat version, primarily designed as a trainer, and kind of combined it with the SU-27P to produce just that, a high-range endurance aircraft with a powerful radar, aerial refueling, and between 87 and 89, different prototypes would fly, and testing would continue throughout the fall of the Soviet Union. In 1994 through 96, the first 5 so-called SU-27PUs were delivered, and then that was it. These are basically two-seaters in the tandem arrangement with the powerful radar, aerial refueling, but they didn't really have a need, and this is the time. So what Sukhoi did, they rebranded it as the SU-30 and tried marketing it to foreign nations, to which they were quite successful. There were 2 basic design paths. There was the SU-30MKK, that was made for China and others, and there was the SU-30MKI, which was a variant kind of based on the SU-27UB for India. And while it was still an interceptor, it was also a high-performance air superiority fighter, multi-role fighter, so with more ground attack. And after India got theirs, the Russian Air Force took a look and decided that they could use this. Even the Russian Navy was interested. It's kind of a shore-based fighter. So the SU-30MKI was fitted with Russian specifications, hardware for Russian weaponry, and became the SU-30SM in 2012. And initially 60 were ordered by the Air Force, plus a smaller number by the Navy. And the first deliveries were late that year. And by 2015, the Air Force had about 2 dozen in service, enough to kind of replace MiG-29s, which were having a hard time of it at the end. They were crashes and kind of failures because they were older aircraft. So they were happy to get these in and replace some older planes. And they would first see combat in Syria. They would send 4 over in September, and this would be up to 12 by the end of that year. They would be used to escort Russian bombers and other aircraft, and then they would also be used to launch attacks at ground targets, because these did have the multi-role capability. These still are not in full operational service at this time. In 2016, the initial order is done, and another order is placed. And in 2018, finally, they're declared fully operational. Even though there was a crash that year killing the crew of 2, Russia still said they were doing better than they expected. Even though we have a 2-seat canopy, overall length is still about 72 inches, with a wingspan of just over 48. Like I said, it is capable of aerial refueling. It can be in the air about 4.5 hours on its own fuel, or up to 10 hours with top off. It has 12 hard points, so like the later 27s, and can carry about 17,600 pounds total ordnance, although of course that would limit range. A mix of air-to-air like the R-27, later R-77, R-73, and air-to-surface munitions like on this one here. Speed and performance-wise, it's slightly slower for the endurance. It's still able to hit Mach 2, maybe a little greater, and has an altitude of about 57,000 feet. But again, it's designed for that. It does feature thrust vectoring, which is kind of nice. At least the later versions will. And it's just kind of a major update, and having a second person in the back does give it a better ability for ground attack. You know, two eyes are better than one, so I'm told. But in 2017, the first efforts were made for a modernized version, and in 2019, orders were placed. This was originally known as the SU-30SM1. It would soon be reclassed as the SU-30SM2, or the Super Flanker, or Super Sukhoi, as the Russian press called it. And essentially, it just took advantage of new technology. You know the deal by now. An updated radar, updated cockpit, access to newer weapons, and it would get the engines from the SU-35, that we'll talk about in a minute, just keeping it updated. And by this point, the number in service have really gone up, and a lot of the older planes have been updated to the SM2 standard, or about to be. And there are new airframes as well. But it's still kind of slow going. Mostly the SM is still the standard. For example, in the Air Force, or the VKS now, they have 92 operational SMs with 19 SM2s, which are still not put in the field yet. They're still being used for training, testing, trials, familiarization. The Navy's in a similar boat. They have about 22 SU-30SMs ready to go, with 4 SM2s presumably also being used for training and familiarization. And they have more on order, of course. And these have been used in Syria and now Ukraine. Again, it's just a high-performance, multi-role fighter. I'd say the major update improvement, aside from having 2 people in the cockpit and being able to carry a larger warload compared to with the Flanker-B, and more hardpoints too, is the fact that it is a little more maneuverable, and it can be refueled in the air, which just, you know, flexibility. Plus, these are newer airframes, and therefore just less quirky. But yeah, this is one of the most successful designs Sukhoi has come up with in the 21st century, because a lot of export customers have come forward to purchase the SU-30. But our next aircraft is also a 2-seater, but built for a rather different role. Now we come to what is quite possibly my favorite, because it's just an interesting concept. The SU-34. And this is not considered a flanker by NATO. It's called the Fullback. And it's a relatively new introduction to the Russian Air Force. And there has been talk about the Russian Navy purchasing some, but I don't know if they have or not. But it's still very much in the Sukhoi SU-27 family, make no mistake. Work began in the late 80s for a 2-seat strike aircraft, fighter bomber, to replace the SU-24 and SU-25 as well, but mainly the 24. And they had a few things they looked at, and it started off as basically the SU-27 KUB, which was the 2-seat version of the naval version. Yeah, but these were just prototypes. It was still very much in the infant stage when the Soviet Union collapsed. The earliest prototypes and everything you'd see around 92, 93, and they started to call it the SU-27IB to differentiate it from others. They would continue to work on it kind of low rate as they had time and energy and funding, showing it off at various air shows. And then they would rename it. The version for the Russian Air Force, if it were to be adopted, would be the SU-34, but the version that they were showing for export was the SU-32. And they had several versions they showed off. For example, a shore-based naval version known as the SU-32FN, and then more of a multi-role version known as the SU-32MF. But there really weren't any takers. And so only a handful had been built, just a couple, as the 21st century rolls on. Finally, though, the VVS gets interested. around 2004, 2005, 2006, and they end up purchasing 5 prototype or pre-production models for testing. And then in 2008, they obtain more, and Sukhoi says it's now in full rate production. But because the design took so long to come around, the Russian Air Force insisted that it be updated, mainly with a new radar and just, compatibility with newer weapon systems, as well as updating the cockpit interface a bit. Now, rumor has it that the earliest kind of testing in the field happened in Georgia in 2008, but officially state trials were not over until 2011, with the earliest production deliveries that year, and by 2014 the SU-34 was considered ready for operations. So what do we have here? In the rear, the wing and the engines are very much like the SU-27. And we have canards in the front, like the SU-30 and SU-33, kind of belying its roots as the SU-27K. But of course, we have this side-by-side seating, not even really a cockpit, it's more of a pellet, a capsule, because it's fully armored, like the SU-25 and SU-24. The crew are well protected with the titanium steel armor, and it's supposed to be basically 360 with armored glass. The only downside, their visibility is less than fantastic, but then again, this is a strike fighter, not a dog fighter. And they even enter from below, not above. They kind of keep it all sealed up. The whole aircraft has more armor, about 1,500 pounds more than the standard SU-27. It's just a beefier plane, so the front section is different. We also have kind of a larger stinger in the back. The overall length is about 76.5 feet, with the width still being about 48, maybe 49 feet, depending on what's on the wingtip rails, because these can carry pods. They're meant to operate in environments with electronic jamming and interference, so pods can be mounted. They have 12 hard points. Like the SU-30, they can carry about 17,600 pounds of ordnance on 12 hard points. But they have quite a wide range of air-to-surface munitions, bombs, guided or otherwise, anti-radiation missiles, and of course they can carry the standard R-73, R-27, R-77 missiles for self-defense mainly. Of course, as famously known, the cockpit capsule has a toilet, it has a small kitchenette, even has sleeping bags on board for getting rest in the little hallway if needs be, because these are designed for long distance bombing flights. Like the 30 and 33, it's capable of aerial refueling and really can stay in the air a very long time. So that's why crew comfort is a thing. It is an interesting aircraft. Now, the top speed is lower than the rest, about Mach 1.7. That's because of it's using the same engines, and we don't have variable intake geometry for the air there. Now, it does have a little bit better performance low altitude based on, well, what it is. It can reach about Mach 1.2. Max altitude is about 56 or 57,000 feet, so, for what it's meant to do. It is fine. Everything's fine. It has the same 30mm cannon, but it has extra shells. It has 180 versus 150 on the others. Again, makes perfect sense for what this is. Really neat machine, and I've done a few videos on it. You might check them out if interested. By 2015, the SU-34 is considered operational, and the first 4 are deployed to Syria in September. They're used for bombing and other missions of a similar nature. By November and December, the number has gone up to a dozen, and it'll kind of fluctuate back and forth throughout the next few years. These were used to replace a lot of SU-24s. For example, the Air Force thought that 70 SU-34s could replace 300 SU-24s, and by 2016 they had 76 operational, they said. So that let them retire a lot of older aircraft, although there's still SU-24s around. Never fear. But yeah, these saw a lot of combat use in Syria. In fact, this model has air-to-surface missiles on the wingtips. Originally in Syria, they were not armed, but after a F-16 shot down an SU-24 in November of 2015, Russia started arming their SU-34s. One neat trick they can do, because of the rear-facing radar, they can launch these missiles. They'll loop around and go behind them. And they've gone head-to-head with Israeli jets and Turkish jets over the years. Orders continue. Right now, they have around 132 operational in the VKS. And that's pretty much the bulk of production. Again, these weren't really an export success. They've been made for the Russian use. And there are plans to have the SU-34M with engine updates, radar updates, etc., although that hasn't happened yet. It's an interesting jet. It's a supersonic strike aircraft that can carry quite a large payload, has a good range, good protection. We don't really have anything quite like it in the West, because it does lean more towards the bomber than a lot of things like the F-15E. Yet it still has a little bit of its fighter heritage. It's not going to get in a dogfight, but it can defend itself, and it is reasonably fast and maneuverable considering the bulk and payload. Cool plane. Check it out if you haven't. But it definitely kind of completes the family and gives it all that direction. So at this point, we've had the base fighter, we've had kind of a high performance air superiority interceptor, we've had a naval version, we've had a strike fighter, and our final version is kind of moving into 4th generation plus, verging on 5th. The SU-35S Flanker-E, or Super Flanker. Very much analogous to the most recent SU-30s in a lot of ways, and kind of the culmination in pushing the limits of the basic SU-27 airframe, and really the most modern mainstay in the Russian VKS, if we're being honest, despite all the SU-57 hullabaloo. But this actually dates back to the very early 80s when Sukhoi was looking, hey, what are we going to do after this SU-27's done? You know, they've got to look ahead in aircraft design bureaus. Well, the Soviet Union said, well, base it on the SU-27. So this would result in the concept of the SU-27M. This was to be an air superiority, multi-role fighter, strike-capable, long-range, good endurance. Essentially just kind of combining things, newer technologies, yada yada. But it never really took off before the end of the Soviet Union. There's a few kind of early prototypes that really aren't SU-27Ms and reworked other ones, yada yada. You start to see the first ones, earliest examples, 1992, 1993. But not really any takers. Essentially it is just an SU-27B type with air-to-ground, aerial refueling, a better radar. It has more fuel on board. Yeah, at this time it still has canards like the other ones. It doesn't really go anywhere. They also have a plane that wowed audiences at the Paris Air Show, I think it was '96, known as the SU-37. It had thrust vectoring nozzles for its engines. Well, this was just an airshow demo of thrust vectoring tech. The truth is, these were not combat-capable engines, but it kind of showed the interest in concept. They would also rename the SU-27M to SU-35, the original one, and still really no takers. So basically the whole idea was shelved. The concept of the SU-37 was just a demo. It never really went anywhere, and things would rest for a time until the early 21st century. Going back to that SU-27SM midlife update program from 2002-2003, Sukhoi revisited the concept of the SU-35 and SU-37, thinking, what can we do? Can we combine stuff here? So they played around with it, and by 2008 they had the SU-35S. Totally different plane, really, from the original SU-35. More of a standard. They get rid of the canards. They lowered the verticals. They integrated the thrust vectoring engines from the SU-37. They gave it multi-role capability, newer cockpit, not stealth, but lower visibility. And they mostly, they were kind of thinking for export markets. But in the end, it was actually the Russian Air Force that was first interested. In 2009, they placed an order. The first Russian militarized version was ready in late 2010, known as the SU-35S, and testing would begin the next year. And they would get a couple of prototypes, and then the first pre-production planes would be delivered around 2012, with deliveries of about a dozen a year for the next few years. And these would be put into frontline service as just air superiority fighters to replace older planes. Export customers would come too. China would be the first in 2015, and Indonesia would soon follow. And the export version is known as the SU-35E, but we're talking about the 35S. Now, for some, when this was declared operational in 2014, this was an interim solution. They were already hoping to go to a true fifth-generation fighter. Work was underway for the PAC-FA, the SU-57. But they thought, hey, this has some of the new technology. It's got an updated radar. It can use a lot of the newer, fancier munitions. The thrust vectoring gave it better maneuverability. We still have a max speed of about Mach 2.2 and down to about Mach 1.2 sea level. Max altitude of about 59,000 feet, a little better. We have an onboard oxygen generation system. Like I said, we have newer technologies to help reduce its radar cross-section. We have 12 hard points that allow it to carry about the same payload as the SU-34, about 17,600 pounds, give or take. It retains the 30mm cannon, down to just 150 rounds again. We have various radar warning systems, electronic jamming. Of course, we can carry air-to-air, air-to-surface, guided munitions, or unguided. You know the deal by now. We're a little larger. We're about 73 feet long. It's mostly because of the new cone. And we're a little bit wider at about 50 feet, depending on what's on the wingtip rails. That can be reduced or greatened depending on the pod or whatever is on there. But in the end, it turned out to actually be a really good aircraft. Again, 4th generation plus or 4th generation plus plus, much like the SU-30SM and SM2s. It's met with success, and orders have continued. Now, this first saw combat use in early 2016 in Syria. Remember I said that when SU-24 was shot down, they first armed their SU-34s. Well, they sent in 4 SU-35s to kind of escort and fly combat air patrol. Now, these were still in the initial operational stage, testing things. So they would let them stretch their legs, figure out what worked and what didn't. They would use them for strike missions. They would use them for escort. They would use them for patrol. They would even use them potentially as dogfighters. And this helped. It helped the developmental process. A few changes were made to the design, and then it was declared fully operational in 2018. And to this point, 100 are officially in the VKS service. I don't think the Navy has looked into buying these, but I could be wrong. Interestingly, the Navy has looked into buying the SU-30SM, not just for shore base, but even for carrier base, so that seems to be the direction they're going. Then again, for a naval aircraft, maybe 2 seats is better. This isn't going to wow anyone. It's not an F-22, but it's kind of on par more with a F-35 or a Eurofighter, F-2000. It really just kind of combines all the technologies, and these are all new build airframes, not refurbished older ones. It's got a good bomb carrying capability. It's very maneuverable. Yeah, it's just a good stable fighter. So while they play with the PAC-FA, they ended up getting a really good aircraft out of it, if not extraordinary. And as I said earlier, a lot of the technology, this kind of started off being inspired by the SU-27SM, and in turn its engines and radar have been carried over to the SU-30SM and SM2. And it does continue to kind of influence as they use it. This model here is in kind of the newer paint scheme, and it's set up in a multi-role configuration. And kind of carries the brand forward. Although it'll be interesting to see if it does stop here or not. It seems like that's the direction they're going. This might be the last. And to be fair, this is kind of as far as you probably can update the SU-27, and it still remain an SU-27. But yeah, let me know what you think. They plan to build at least 200 of these, and they, like I said, have delivered over 100, including prototypes, to the Russians, plus the Chinese and Indonesians, so it's a pretty successful design for Sukhoi in the 21st century. Yes, I know, I'm incapable of making short videos. Oh well. Hey, you're not paying by the minute. In fact, you're not paying at all, come to think of it. Hobo agrees. No, I had to get some of these off the shelf for dusting and whatnot, and thought, yeah, I promised when I did the SU-30 video I'd try to do a big Sukhoi layout. I kind of felt in the mood today. And, I don't know, I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's interesting that the size and the performance really hasn't changed a great deal. Even though we've got specialized variants, multi-role variants, we've got 2 different styles of 2-seater, tandem and side-by-side. We've got operating from air bases, shore bases, aircraft carriers. We've got essentially dedicated strike aircraft, fighter bombers, although by now they're all multi-role. The idea of a strictly and only air superiority dogfighter, that's over, that's gone, that's just not the modern world and modern combat we live in. Most of these, the variants we see here, first saw combat in Syria, although a couple might have been used in Georgia. And of course, these are still being deployed today, first in Crimea, today all over Ukraine. And Ukraine themselves have updated SU-27s that they fly, although they don't have access and really don't own any of the newer variants. But Hobbymaster really does do a good job with these models. The only negative I can say, they sure take up a hell of a lot of shelf space. But yeah, they're a good size in 1/72 scale. It's a good size for them. Any bigger, they'd be a little hard to manage. Any smaller, you might lose detail. But I mean, heck, they're about 1 foot long, give or take, and about 9 inches wide at that. So figured this might be topical and of interest. So which one is your favorite? I have to say I still think the 34 is kind of the coolest, just because it's maybe the most radically different. But I do kind of like this updated SM, just because. And I'm really happy they're now doing a SM in the SU-30 series as well. And the 35 is a pretty sleek, modern looking aircraft for what it is. And thank God it doesn't have a pitot tube. Those get really annoying on models, trust me. Well guys, I think we're good here. Appreciate you hanging out with me. If you could, do please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time. This is